Well, hello and welcome to North Star Oasis. I'm your host, Jeff Williams. We're here for another jam-packed, action-filled information overload headed your way for the next hour here on this 23rd of May, 2019. The legislative session is over. The Mueller investigation is over. As we get into the end of May, we can actually start looking forward, hopefully, to brighter days. But with that, I struggled with what I was going to present this week because there's just a lot of things going on out there. We've got things going on in Venezuela. We've got the 75th anniversary of D-Day coming up just after Memorial Day. But really, I thought that it was time to take a closer look at some of the things that are happening in government this week. I've looked in the last few weeks about our history, going back on the Watergate scandal and the Clinton impeachment. We're going to put that aside for the week, well, for the most part. We're going to take a look at what happened at this session of the legislature and the compromise that was reached. But before we do anything else, to kind of set this up, let's take a look at the arguments of capitalism versus socialism. Because I think whenever it comes to government, that should always be in the back of your mind. Are we in a capitalist society, a socialist society? These are the forces that are at work and at play whenever they have legislative negotiations for the budget. So with our Prager University segment of the week, we're going to look at capitalism versus socialism.
Capitalism versus socialism. We can sum up each economic system in one line. Capitalism is based on human greed. Socialism is based on human need, right? No. Wrong, so wrong. It's exactly backwards. And I'll prove it to you. Been on Amazon lately? Each of the thousands of products Amazon offers represents the work of people who believe they have something you want or need. If they're right, they prosper. If they're wrong, they don't. That's how the free market works. It encourages people to improve their lives by satisfying the needs of others. No one starts a business making a thing or providing a service for themselves. They start a business to make things or provide services for others. I speak from personal experience. When I was the CEO of the company that owns Carl's Jr. and Hardee's restaurant chains, we spent millions of dollars every year trying to determine what customers wanted. If our customers didn't like something, we changed it, and fast. Because if we didn't, our competitors would, pun intended, eat us for lunch. The consumer, that's you, has the ultimate power. In effect, you vote with every dollar you spend. In a socialist economy, the government has the ultimate power. It decides what you get from a limited supply it decides should exist. Instead of millions of people making millions of decisions about what they want, a few people, government elites, decide what people should have and how much they should pay for it. Not surprisingly, they always get it wrong. Have you ever noticed that late-stage socialist failures always run out of essential items like toilet paper? Of course, this isn't a problem for those who have the right connections with the right people. Those chosen few get whatever they want. But everyone else is out of luck. Venezuela, once the richest country in South America, is the most recent example of socialism driving a prosperous country into an economic ditch. Now, maybe you think it's an unfair example. I'm not sure why, but okay. We'll ignore the fact that leftist activists celebrated it as a great socialist success right up until it wasn't. But what about Western European countries? Don't they have socialist economies? People seem pretty happy there. Why can't we have what they have? Free healthcare, free college, stronger unions. Good question, and the answer may surprise you. There are no socialist countries in Western Europe. Most are just as capitalist as the United States. The only difference, and it's a big one, is that they offer more government benefits than the U.S. does. We can argue about the cost of these benefits and the point at which they reduce individual initiative, thus doing more harm than good. Scandinavians have been debating those questions for years. But only a free market capitalist economy can produce the wealth necessary to sustain all of the supposedly free stuff Europeans enjoy. To get the free stuff, after all, You have to create enough wealth to generate enough tax revenue to pay for everything the government gives away. Without capitalism, you're Venezuela. In a 2015 speech at Harvard, Denmark's prime minister took great pains to make this point. I know that some people in the U.S. associate the Nordic model with socialism. Therefore, I would like to make one thing clear. Denmark is far from a socialist planned economy. Denmark is a market economy. So when you point to Denmark as a paragon of socialism, you're really singing the praises of capitalism. The more capitalism, the less socialism you need. Look at America since 2017. A policy of lower taxes and less government regulation, that's more capitalism, has led to a robust economic expansion, something thought impossible just a few years earlier. Unemployment, notably among minority groups typically most at risk for poverty, is at a generational low. Economic expansion gets people off welfare and into work. That's less socialism. None of this requires a degree in economics. Common sense is all you need. That's why it's so frustrating to see young people praising socialism and criticizing capitalism. It's bad enough that they're working against their own interests, better job prospects, better wages, personal freedom. But they're also working against the interest of the less fortunate. Capitalism leads to economic democracy. Socialism leads to the economic dictatorship of the elite, always and everywhere. So beware what you ask for. You just might get it. I'm Andy Puzder, the author of The Capitalist Comeback for Prager University.
And there you have it. That is a very good look at a basic introductory level for capitalism versus socialism. And I bring that up because here we are at the very end of yet another legislative session. And this session started out with all these promises that things are going to be different. We are going to be better. We're going to be more transparent. Things are going to happen. We're going to get along, and we got the same old, same old. Does it really surprise you? I hope not. Nonetheless, Minnesota leaders did actually get their work done almost on time. Governor Walz and Senate Majority Leader Paul Gazelka and Speaker Melissa Hortman got together numerous times over the last couple of weeks. They were very, very quiet when they were in the negotiating session, and they ended up coming up with a compromise plan that they hope that everybody can live with. Of course, we're dealing with politicians, so not everybody's going to live with that. More on that in just a little bit. So here is just a quick preview as to what their bipartisan budget deal looks like.
Hey, Chris. Well, gas tax is gone. Medical provider tax stays. But the really good news about all this is that we're having this discussion in May instead of June. All those closed-door talks led them to someplace in the middle.
There's a lot to like in here. There's a lot of compromise that will be made, but I think the people of Minnesota will be served well.
After days of shuttling in and out of closed-door meetings, the DFL Speaker of the House and the GOP Senate Majority Leader were in the same place, standing next to Governor Walz.
Sometimes we pushed each other, but in the end, I think we found that place in the middle, which you have to find in divided government. And for whatever reason, Minnesota regularly picks this.
And I asked Paul a couple of times, I said, please listen to me. And a very, very rare trait, he listened.
Compromise was the key word. The governor's 20-cent per gallon gas tax hike plan, gone. The medical provider tax, on the books for 27 years, will stay, but at 1.8% instead of 2%.
We agreed to a budget deal. We are leaving it to the leadership of all of the members of the legislature and the commissioners of the state of Minnesota to work out the agreements in public with the input of the public.
State aid to schools, 2% each year, lower than the House ask, but more than the Senate's. Also, an income tax cut for people in the second tier. Prison safety, $50 million in new money. On MNLARS, a deal that includes $55 million to replace it and $13 million to reimburse those deputy registrars.
When it got tough and it looked like it wasn't going to happen, it was Speaker Hortman's dogged determination to drag us back to that table.
There's also a $500 million for public works construction bonding, But House Minority Leader Kurt Doubt hinted strongly he won't deliver the Republican votes needed.
They have not come to us and asked. They created this deal on their own without including us.
So there are 75 Democrats in the House, but it takes 81 votes to pass a bonding bill. So that's where Doubt could have some power here and keep Republicans from voting for a bonding bill. Now, even though we have a deal, we're going to have to go to a special session because these conference committees that are meeting, they have to button up 10 finance bills, the 10 bills that are the building blocks of the budget, and they can't get all that done between now and tomorrow night at midnight. So that's why we're going to have a special session, most likely Thursday, but that still is to be determined. Back to you.
Yeah, some bipartisan complimenting there too. Kind of rare. Thank you, John.
Well, that's what the legislative leaders and the governor agreed to. Now, mind you, when I say the leaders, I'm only talking about the majority leaders. Not talking about the minority leaders. They were frozen out of the process. State Senator Tom Bach, leader of the Senate minority, he wasn't there. Kurt Doubt, State Representative, leader of the House minority, he wasn't there either. The minority factions of both chambers were shut out of the process. This is the governor and the two majority leaders. We're going to take a look right now at the beginning of the press conference when they announced the budget agreement. I wanted to give you the budget agreement details first. When I was watching the press conference, I'm sitting there waiting and waiting and waiting. Okay, well, what's going to happen here? Is there going to be a gas tax? Is there not? What's going on? And it wasn't much until much later in the Q&A session that they actually started getting into the nitty-gritty. I didn't figure I would bore you with all of these waiting for some anticipation that we're just not going to get to. So that's the meat. Now let's give you the potatoes. So let's take a look at the opening of the press conference from Sunday.
Can this be done by Thursday or Friday? Senator Gazelka just said on the Senate floor he's hopeful special session Thursday and/or Friday.
You know, I don't.
Sorry, that was not the correct video clip. This is the number 3 replacement. This one, the one that you had just seen, is one we're going to get to about the House Minority Leader and his media availability. But please stand by. We're having technical difficulties. Did we find the correct video? Let's give it a try. Waiting for our producer here. Well, nonetheless.
With this session update, I'm Shannon Lurkey. Governor Tim Walz, House Speaker Melissa Hortman, and Senate Majority Leader Paul Gazelka reached a budget agreement today, and a few minutes ago finished a press conference explaining the next steps. Here's what they had to say.
Well, good evening, everyone. First of all, I'd like to say a thank you to the journalists in the room for your patience and professionalism. You inform Minnesotans. We acknowledge the frustrations you've been feeling. We can do better as Minnesotans. We will continue to. This team is committed, and we're here together, which I think you're going to hear and see is the Minnesota way of doing things. At my State of the State address, I said we were going to try and find a different way to do this for Minnesota, that we were going to write our own story. And that's exactly what we did. Instead of dysfunction and shutdowns and yelling, we have compromise agreements, and as we said coming out, we're still friends. We're here to announce an agreement has been reached on a 2-year state budget for Minnesota. I'm going to clap. I'm going to clap. This is a budget that invests in education, health care, and community prosperity in a fiscally responsible manner. Today, we prove that divided government can work for the betterment of the people we serve. As one of only 2 divided state governments in the country, we reached a bipartisan agreement on time for the first time in over a decade. That happened because of all of the hard work of the legislators, some of whom are here, the staff that worked together, the advocates, and the people of Minnesota. They sent us all a strong message. Fight hard for the things we believe in, but view compromise and moving Minnesota forward as a top priority. Do so with dignity and do so with honor as you reach this, and try and get your work done on time. That wouldn't have happened without the leadership of Senator Paul Gazelka. Paul, for your leadership and your advocacy for the causes you hold dear, for sticking up for not just your caucus, but for all Minnesotans. You helped us get this done. And I have to tell you, there were times during these negotiations, as you could expect, that become very, very difficult. And in those times, each of us asked, and I asked Paul a couple of times, I said, please listen to me. And a very, very rare trait, he listened deeply and tried to understand what was on my heart and where we were coming from. In a negotiation, there's numbers, there's lots of things happening, but it is truly about relationships, trust, and building for a common good. So, Senator Gazelka, thank you. On behalf of Minnesotans, thank you for doing that. And personally, as a friend, thank you for listening. I appreciate it. And then there's Speaker Hortman, who I have to give the dearest thanks. A true partner in this, again, an advocate as the Speaker of the House, certainly advocating for her caucus, but advocating for the unique People's House, where many of these discussions are taken and the battles are waged over this way, the direction that Minnesota is going to go. And I will have to tell you, in these negotiations, when it got tough and it looked like it wasn't going to happen, it was Speaker Hortman's dogged determination to drag us back to that table, to continue to try to find a way to do that. And when it comes down to it, leadership is about setting that purpose, direction, and then motivating us to get that done. That is exactly what Speaker Hortman did. With that, Speaker Hortman.
Thank you. Well, I'm very proud that we were able to work together to get this deal accomplished. You know, the House CFL came in committed to building a Minnesota that works better for all of us. And I'm really proud to say that in the budget deal that we agreed to, we have very strong funding for education, both at the elementary school through 12th grade level, and also at the higher education level, an area I fought particularly hard for. We made a good faith effort with earlier deadlines and pushing as much as we could earlier into the month of May, doing our work in April on the floors of the House and the Senate. And with regard to the transparency, I can't change the culture of the legislature single-handedly or overnight. And that is a process to change the culture. But what you will see is there's 3 leaders here who have devolved a lot of power out of the negotiating room and into the hands of the commissioners and the chairs of the committee. And those conversations are happening in public in conference committees. We agreed to a budget deal. We are leaving it to the leadership of all of the members of the legislature and the commissioners of the state of Minnesota to work out the agreements in public with the input of the public to even further enrich this deal that's in the best interest of Minnesotans. And so significant that we finish this work on time. Minnesotans expect a government that works. They expect leaders that will work literally around the clock to make sure that the state stays working for them. And I am very proud that we 3 were able to achieve this really strong and fair budget agreement and to do it on time.
Well, I'm glad we're here saying that we got it done. Both sides, when you have divided government, want to win. Both sides don't want to lose. And sometimes instead of win or lose, it's a draw. And that's what we had here today. It was a draw, and it was good for Minnesota. We knew that we had to focus on making sure we took care of the fundamentals, and that got done. Like they mentioned, there is ample funding for education, both higher ed and E12. We all looked at Health and Human Services and said, how can we deliver the resources that we have in the best of our ability to the people that needed it? All of us agreed on that. And that was true of every one of the budget areas. We looked at it sometimes from a different lens. Sometimes we pushed each other. But in the end, I think we found that place in the middle, which you have to find in divided government. And for whatever reason, Minnesota regularly picks this. But I've got to tell you, it's extremely difficult to get done when you actually have to do it. And first of all, for Speaker Hortman, she earned her stripes. She definitely rose to the occasion. She had some vision about how we could do things different, and those things actually made a big difference in helping us get to the end. She was professional and honorable. And same thing with Governor Walz. Yes, he's been in Washington, but now he's in Minnesota. And we were mostly Minnesota nice, mostly. But honestly, when we disagreed with passion, it was still professional. We sometimes took a break, took a step back. But as you found out in the media, we never really said anything that we would have regretted, because frankly, we worked pretty well together when you consider that we were so far apart. And so my hat's off to both the governor and the speaker for the work that I think we did. And so it was a draw, but the things that needed to get done are done for us. You know, one of the highlights of what we were really trying to accomplish was that middle-class tax cut. First time in, I believe, 2 decades that we've actually lowered an income tax rate, and it was the rate just above, not the lowest rate, but the next one up we lowered, which should impact a lot of people. A lot more things that got done, but that's the highlight I want to focus on today.
Well, again, as you see, we continue, and I think my pledge to all of you in this room and to Minnesotans, to folks up here, to continue to make government responsive. We know there's more to be done, but I'll have to tell you, there was a lot of listening went on and true compromise. I think Minnesota, again, rose to an occasion of where we wanted to be. There's a lot to like in here. There's a lot of compromise that will be made, but I think the people of Minnesota will be served well. And with that, finally, we're ready for questions. Yeah, well, I made no bones about it. I don't think there's any disagreement that we want to all find a way to get infrastructure fixed. We couldn't come to agreement where that was. And look, I'm a school teacher from Mankato. I'm going to focus on what those investments, education you saw in here, health care, some of the other things, and we'll come back at that from another angle. That was all. Yes, we went down, and there will be no gas tax this year. I certainly, you're going to get this, I think, in your inbox, all the details of this. That was a part that it was part of the negotiations. We'll come back at it. I don't think the need is going to change, but we'll come back and take some time to figure out a different approach to that.
Provider tax, what happens with that?
Yeah, the provider tax, the sunset is gone, and the provider tax will be 1.8 from now on. And again, that is a part of the compromise, part of what we did. We tried to meet on some of these things, and I think, again, prioritizing the Health and Human Services, trying to find the savings Senator Gazelka talked about, trying to get better efficiencies. But one of the things I think, instead of having dueling press conferences and acrimony in this, we all agree we need to take care of Minnesotans. We need to try and figure this out, and I think that agreement of lifting the sunset was the way to go.
And I would like to pay a compliment to Senator Gazelka there, because, you know, it's a very hard thing to do. Something that you don't want to do. And to put the interests of Minnesotans and the health care of Minnesotans above political ideology. We really worked hard, and we're going to do some innovative new things. The governor, I think, and Senator Gazelka are capable of being the state's people who lead us forward on bending the cost curve in health care. We have a really expensive future in health care. And so I think this was an area where Senator Gazelka deserves a lot of credit for rising to the occasion and being a leader, even though it was very difficult.
How does that affect the One Care plan, and Governor, if you would comment on that as well?
Well, a couple of things. That would be the area that we have a draw. Where we aligned is we know that we have to drive down the cost of health care, and so there's a number of things that I think will end up in the Health and Human Services bill that will do that, whether it was One Care or the route we're going now. We put it out in the report, too, but we compromised on reinsurance. We wanted 3 years. Their plan was to go away. We settled 2 years because we reached out to the hospitals and the providers, and that's where they felt like it should be.
I agree with Senator. Look, I think one of the things is that what you see is you sometimes get competing visions. We laid out a vision where we wanted Minnesota to go to, but with an understanding we have things that we need to take care of, things we need to move, things that we need to go that can wait, if you will. And I think this healthcare piece, there's an agreement of working together to find that, to not draw you know, the total removal of the provider tax we felt would have put too many people at risk, and we weren't ready at this point in time to say what's coming next, that we're going to try and work on it together. And I agree. I think the Speaker and the leader have said so. These are compromises that work. The good news that I'm going to say today is that the health care that is delivered by that 1.1 million Minnesotans and 43% of our children are not at risk of the sunset of the provider tax, and that's a good thing.
So that is the tentative agreement from the legislative leaders and the governor. Before we give you the House Minority Leader's response, We're going to take a look real quick at the House side of things and where we go next. Friday, tomorrow at 8:30 a.m. is a House Health and Human Services Finance Division hearing. And then on Saturday is the first special session starting at 8 o'clock a.m. That's on the House side of things in order to finish up. You know, we're another special session. There's nothing special about the special session. This is the way we've been operating for the last 17 years. I don't think I recall since before 9/11 a single year where we've gone with just a regular session. I remember back in the 90s, I used to sit in the gallery and watch some of the gamesmanship going on, but they always adjourned with a budget deal and everything already signed and agreed to and passed, and that was when the legislators all went home for the rest of the year. I mean, they go back for regular office visits, but they would complete their work on time for the legislature. Since around 2001, that's all we've had, a special session. I mean, maybe around 04, 05, I seem to remember we had a last night of legislative session when then State Senate Majority Leader Jim Metzen, ended up getting a DUI on the way home from the Capitol, and he lived in South St. Paul. That might have been a non-special session date, but at least in the last 10 years for sure, I mean, in all 8 years of Mark Dayton's administration, we've had special sessions. They're not special anymore. So here we are, we're going to go into a special session in order to finish up the work from the legislature. Anyhow, we're going to take a look right now at Representative Kurt Doubt, the Minnesota House Republican Minority Leader, and what his thoughts are on the way that this matter was handled.
Can this be done by Thursday or Friday? Senator Gazelka just said on the Senate floor he's hopeful special session Thursday and/or Friday.
You know, I don't think so, and not only do I not think so, I don't think we should. I don't think it makes sense. This has been the least productive, least transparent session in the history of the state. Minnesotans should be ashamed of the process at the end of this legislative session. They passed one budget bill to the governor's desk, one budget bill. The last time they passed only one budget bill or less was 1985. This has been a horribly non-transparent process. They actually, this last bill that they tried to pass without giving us any time to read the bill was actually posted for us publicly to see, or we were notified of the posting after it had passed the Senate. There was no time to read this bill. And we also found out that a conference committee didn't even sign off on didn't meet publicly, so the public had no input. They just simply signed the report and filed the bill for us to take up. While that meets the legal requirement, it doesn't meet what Democrats in the Minnesota House said they were going to do. A lot of folks have asked us about suspending the rules and what that means for special session. The governor and the two leaders, majority leaders, entered into an agreement on a budget in this state. They did not include the minority leaders. They said that they were going to have a transparent and open process. They did not. What will be dependent on us suspending the rules will be if they can change course and actually create an open, transparent process where people can be involved in the process. I'm not going to stand for this dark of night, making decisions behind closed doors with no one knowing what's in the bill. The authors of the bills didn't know what was in the bills. We didn't have spreadsheets. The spreadsheets that we did get didn't match the bills. This is an absolute shame on the Democrats who are running the chamber in the Minnesota House of Representatives. And they were the ones who said they were going to do it different and going to do it better. And they did it worse than anyone I've ever seen in the history of the state.
Any change, or have you talked with them about the bonding bill since we chatted, earlier this evening? Have there been any developments since then?
I was first approached this session about a bonding bill at 1:30 this afternoon on the very last day of the legislative session. I don't think it serves people well when that's such an afterthought that we're not thinking about it until the later half of the day on the very last day of session. We're also not happy about Democrats insistent on raising health care costs in the state of Minnesota by putting a provider tax on every health care procedure in the state. By the way, I know Representative Winkler wanted to claim that this is a health care fee that goes to actually cover health care. It is not. The things that the provider tax was put in place to cover are now covered by the federal government. The provider tax literally goes into a slush fund to pay general fund expenses. This is bad public policy to tax sick people to pay for wasteful spending in our general fund. It's absolutely shameful, and frankly, Minnesotans should not stand for it. What Democrats insisted on in the state of Minnesota was making health care more expensive for Minnesotans. I don't know how they can face the voters after this.
You talking about Senator Gazelka? I mean, he agreed to this.
Well, I think he had to agree to something, right? You couldn't have the governor walk away with nothing. But the Democrats' demands of $12 billion worth of tax increases over the next 4 years on Minnesotans were absolutely unreasonable. And if people want to know why this session was a failure, why we ended with the least productive session since 1985, it's because Democrats demanded $12 billion of tax increases and wouldn't give until the very last minute. And frankly, they gave on everything except their demand to raise health care costs on Minnesotans. It's absolutely shameful and unacceptable, and Minnesotans should demand better of their elected officials.
Your criticisms of House Democrats on the transparency, doesn't that go for Senate Republicans as well? I mean, they were just as responsible for the lack of open meetings today.
Well, I'm going to let them answer for that, but I see what happens here in the Minnesota House, and it was Minnesota House Democrats who said they were going to be transparent all along. Every opportunity, they said they were going to do it different, they were going to do it better, and they broke their word to Minnesotans, not only on the campaign trail when they said they were going to lower costs, and then they came here in the chamber and at every opportunity voted to raise health care costs on Minnesotans. They broke their word, and this was the least transparent session in state history. Minnesotans should be ashamed of the Democrats' conduct in the Minnesota House of Representatives.
And there you have it. So we see what the Speaker had to say. Now we see what the House Minority Leader had to say. And this is what happens when we live with divided government. Yes, divided government. That's what we have. That's why you have compromises. The Republicans are even divided amongst themselves. 4 members right after the election have decided to form their own caucus, the new House Republican Caucus. And Representative Steve Drazkowski pretty much heads up that caucus, and he had put a press release out right after the compromise and the legislative session ended. And go ahead and put the press release up. And so there's the new House Republican Caucus, and if we scroll down, we can actually look at the beginning here. Governor Walz is the big loser of the year when the 2019 legislative session crashed to a halt on Monday night, said Representative Steve Drazkowski, Republican from Mazeppa. Governor Walz was inexperienced and incompetent, Representative Drazkowski said. There was nothing in the last hour agreement that he could not have had a week ago, but he lacked the experience to compromise and meet the deadline. By demanding so much, he lost so much more, said Representative Drazkowski. As of the Monday deadline, the Democrats had not achieved a single one of their top 10 goals. While other House Republicans criticized the House Democrats and decried the Senate Republicans, they missed the point, Representative Drazkowski said. Quote, if Governor Walz had pivoted a week earlier, he could have succeeded, Drazkowski said. But he just dug in his heels and lost everything. If the Senate Republicans had not passed a lights-on bill on Saturday, the governor would not have yielded an inch and we would be facing a government shutdown. Since the hands of the House are also tied by the absence of budget targets for each major bill, quote, since no general targets were set until Sunday evening, neither the House nor the Senate negotiators had a chance. And so here, and that's pretty much all I'm going to cover from that. It goes on and on with the same old thing. But the biggest takeaway from this, and this is where I guess I disagree. Well, let's go to page 2. Page 2, first sentence. It is unsurprising that Governor Walz could not negotiate against experienced legislators, Representative Drazkowski said. The governor was competing with smart legislators, not teenage football players. Drazkowski was also skeptical that the pending compromise will stand up in Thursday's scheduled special session. All right, come back to me. Here's where I disagree with Drazkowski. Tim Walz did spend a decade in Congress, and he has been in sessions with people of the likes of Paul Ryan and Nancy Pelosi, John Boehner, Nancy Pelosi. Nancy Pelosi pretty much led the House the entire time that Walz was there. I don't think that Walz is unexperienced here. I don't think he's incompetent either. I think he's actually a much smarter cookie than Mark Dayton. The only difference is Mark Dayton was always the one person that you could count on to renege from his promises. So many sessions would end up in turmoil. Why? Because we had an experienced governor. The governor would come in and say, this is what I want, I'm going to have what I want, nobody's going to tell me any different. And then even when he agrees to a compromise with the Republicans, Governor Dayton would then, after session had adjourned, including special sessions, then the gamesmanship would continue. I remember when Governor Dayton had done a line item veto on funding the legislature. And it took going to the courts in order to get that taken care of before the next legislative session began. Even last year we had the tax conformity. When the House Republicans in Washington had passed a tax cut at the federal level, there had to have been a bill in the state legislature to make sure that Minnesota's tax code is in sync with the federal tax code. That tax conformity should have happened. It was negotiated, and Dayton decided to not sign it. So if we have an inexperienced and incompetent governor, according to Drazkowski, who actually makes a reasonable compromise, is that really a bad thing here? That once the special session ends, and I looked for the Senate calendar and I have been unable to find it, so I don't exactly know what's happening there. But once the special session is done, it's done. The legislature is over with for this year. They won't be convening again until, when's the next session here? The 2020 regular session of the Minnesota legislature is scheduled to convene on Tuesday, February 11th, 2020. We don't have to deal with the shenanigans that we had with Mark Dayton. That's why I disagree. And then my producer made a valid point that Dayton was acting a lot like a bully in the playground. We don't have that anymore. I may disagree with Governor Walz on procedures and agendas and ideology, but I have to say that to put the heads of the two legislative chambers together in a series of closed-door meetings to actually forge a compromise that was a real compromise when the Democrats actually had to give something up, unlike the Washington term of bipartisanship, which means Republicans capitulate to Democrats again. This really was a compromise. And so I disagree vehemently with Drazkowski on this. That Walz was the big loser? No, I think we're dealing with government, period. I still think the taxpayers are the biggest losers because spending's still going to go up by 6%. We have a tax rate cut in this compromise. We did not get an increase in license tab fees. We did not have a 20 cent a gallon or even a 1 cent a gallon gas tax increase. So there's some small victories there, but spending's still going to go up by 6%. And as you heard Representative Doudt say just a moment ago, that the sick tax is actually going to go right into the general fund. I have problems with that. So really, the big loser are we taxpayers. But we're always the big losers when it comes to legislative sessions and the budget. Period. And this is a bipartisan comment because both parties have increased spending. You know, when I first got involved in Minnesota government back 30 years ago, the biennial budget was around $13 billion a year. Now it's $48 billion a year. Yet our population has been stable. We haven't really grown, but we haven't shrunk too much either. What's changed? I will say this, that inflation set at the federal level has changed. The dollar isn't worth as much as it was 30 years ago. But what's changed is that you have legislators from both parties who think that taxpayer money equals what their ability to spend. Go back to the Prager University segment about capitalism versus socialism. And as the late Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher used to say, socialism is a good thing until you run out of other people's money. That hasn't changed. So again, the biggest losers, the taxpayers. I will credit State Senator Roger Chamberlain, who is actually the chairman of the Senate Tax Committee. I could not find the clip. I really wanted to play it for you today, but unfortunately I couldn't find it in time. A few weeks ago, Chamberlain, I don't remember if it was a committee or on the regular floor of the session, said the one group of people that we really need to thank are the taxpayers, the ones footing the bill. That's absolutely right. When this country was founded, when we declared our independence from Britain, one of the biggest things, the driving forces behind that, was taxation without representation. Remember that, taxation without representation. We had a Tea Party. Why? The Tea Party occurred simply because it was a way of not paying the excise tax. And I'll give you just a quick digression here into history. Realize that we had the 100 Years' War going on. When I say we, I'm looking mainly at Great Britain and France. They were fighting for about 100 years. The French Indian War, 1753, that was part of it. England and France were having a serious war. And when you're fighting a war, that means you need to raise the revenues to pay for the war. And what did England do? They looked at the colonies. Said, hey, we got 13 colonies over there in America. Let's make them pay for it. So they were doing more and more and more and more. If it pleases the crown, here's more tax money. They taxed everything, stamps, tea, and we were big tea drinkers back then, tobacco. We were a big exporter of tobacco. But it was the fact that the British government needed more money and they took more money. And they did not give the American colonies representation in the Parliament. And I'll tell you this, if Parliament and the King would have all said, hey, make sure that they have a voice too, we probably would still be British subjects. We probably would have. The fact is we did not have a seat at the table to fight for our own rights, and we were the ones being taxed. But now, fast forward almost 250 years. Taxation without representation. You're being taxed. You're footing the bill. Unfortunately, in today's day and age, and again, bipartisan, both parties, and not just the Minnesota legislature, but it also exists at the federal legislative level with Congress and the U.S. Senate, House and Senate. Do our politicians have our best interest in mind? Some of them do. Roger Chamberlain, Kurt Doubt. There's no doubt in my mind that some of these guys do have our best interest. And to a certain extent, I'll even say Representative Steve Drazkowski, even though I think his press conference was just wrong, or his press release was wrong, I do think that he I do think that his heart's in the right place, even though I don't agree with his decision on the press release. But the fact remains that we have taxation without representation. Maybe this is what Drazkowski was really referring to. We have a governor who's not representing the taxpayer, but representing the special interest. We have a Speaker of the House that represents her progressive caucus, who represents the socialist wing of the Democratic Party and the lobbyists associated with them that don't necessarily have your interest in mind. In a way, I kind of feel for Paul Gazelka. outnumbered in negotiating meetings 2-1. What do? You try to do the best you can to make sure that the taxpayers are protected. But even then, there are probably some areas that Gazelka could have been a little bit better on. That's what happens with divided government. But you know what? Rather than having one-party rule where we'd have a 20-cent a gallon gas tax, increase in the provider tax, and increase in every other tax, and license tabs fees, and driver's license fees, and a MNLAR system that instead of costing 55 would be 155 million. That's what happens sometimes with one-party rule. Divided government's not always bad. Now, my advice to Kurt Dowd, the House Minority Leader, if you want a seat at that table, then you better work your tail off in making sure you get more members on your side so you become the Speaker again. Because the fact is, you lost the election in 2018. You had the opportunity. You were the Speaker of the House. So now you're sitting here crying that you got shut out of the process. You got shut out of the process because you were used to being in those negotiating sessions with the governor. And now you're on the outside looking in. That if you want to become the person who sits at that table in negotiating with the governor, don't let your own caucus down. That's just my advice to the former Speaker, now House Minority Leader. We are going to move on. We are starting to run out of time, so we're going to take a look right now at something that the current U.S. House of Representatives Speaker Nancy Pelosi had to say coming out of a meeting with fellow Democrats yesterday.
So, Madam Speaker, have you guys come to a conclusion?
We are going to the White House.
What did you tell the caucus about where you stand and where they stand?
We had a very productive meeting. We do believe that it's important to follow the facts. We believe that no one is above the law, including the President of the United States, and we believe that the President of the United States is engaged in a cover-up, and that was the nature of the meeting.
Did you have successful meeting on the position of some of your members on impeachment or contempt or anything? Is that part of the persuasion at this stage?
It wasn't a question of persuasion. We were just exchanging information and points of view. Really, we have this important meeting with the President. I think.
Can you still have that meeting, though, with all?
So the Speaker of the House went to a meeting alleging that the President was part of a cover-up, tells that to reporters while she's on her way to a meeting over infrastructure at the White House. Do you think the President is really going to take too kind to that? Do you think he's really going to sit there and say, oh, hey, I'm involved in cover-up, and let's just talk about it? No, not this President. He spent 3 minutes with Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi and then walked out of the meeting. That's what he did. Then he had a press conference in the Rose Garden where he explained himself. Let's take a look.
Thank you very much. Good morning. So I came here to do a meeting on infrastructure with Democrats, not really thinking they wanted to do infrastructure or anything else other than investigate. And I just saw that Nancy Pelosi, just before our meeting, made a statement that we believe that the President of the United States is engaged in a cover-up. Well, it turns out I'm the most, and I think most of you would agree to this, I'm the most transparent president probably in the history of this country. We have given on a witch hunt, on a hoax. The whole thing with Russia was a hoax as it relates to the Trump administration and myself. It was a total horrible thing that happened to our country. It hurt us in so many ways. Despite that, we're setting records with the economy, with jobs, with the most people employed today that we've ever had in the history of our country. We have the best unemployment numbers that we've had in the history of our country, in some cases 51 years, but generally in the history of our country. Companies are moving back in. Things are going well. And I said, let's have the meeting on infrastructure. We'll get that done easily. That's one of the easy ones. And instead of walking in happily into a meeting, I walk in to look at people that had just said that I was doing a cover-up. I don't do cover-ups. You people know that probably better than anybody. And I was just looking at a list of some of the things that we just did. More than 2,500 subpoenas qualified for. And I let everybody talk. I let the White House counsel speak for 30 hours. 30 hours. I have 19 special counsel lawyers, 40 FBI agents. I said, open it all up. Let them have whatever they want. Nearly 500 search warrants. Think of that, a search warrant. Did you ever see a search warrant before? Neither did I. This was over 500 search warrants. And of the 19 people that were heading up this investigation, or whatever you want to call it, with Bob Mueller, they were contributors to the Democrat Party, most of them, and to Hillary Clinton. They hated President Trump. They hated him with a passion. They went to her big party after the election that turned out to be a wake. Not a party, it was a wake. And they were very angry. These are the people that after 2 years and $40 million or $35 million, it'll end up being a lot more than that by the time all the bills are paid. This is what happened. No collusion, no obstruction, no nothing. They issued 50 orders authorizing use of pen registers. Think of that, though, 500 witnesses. And then I have Nancy Pelosi go out and say that the President of the United States engaged in a cover-up. Now, we've had a House investigation. We have Senate investigations. We have investigations like nobody's ever had before, and there's nothing, we did nothing wrong. They would have loved to have said we colluded. They would have loved it. These people were out to get us. The Republican Party and President Trump. They were out to get us. This was a one-sided, horrible thing. The bottom line is they said there's no collusion with Russia. You heard so much talk about phone calls that my son made to me from this meeting that was set up by GPS Fusion, it looks like, which is the other side for those that don't know. And for a year, I heard about phone calls went to a special number, unauthorized. And it would have been my son, Don, who's a good young man, who's gone through hell. And they were calls that must have been made by him before and after the meeting, 3 calls. After massive study and work, they actually found who made the calls. One was a friend of ours, a real estate developer. Great guy, most of you know him, nice guy, loves our country. And the other one was the head of NASCAR, 2 of them. So of the 3 calls that were so horrible that he had a meeting and he called me, and then he had the meeting after, and he made 2 more calls. And they were written about like this little lines, couple of lines. Nobody wanted to admit it. Even last night, we had a great election. I went there on Monday. We had an election for Fred Keller. It was a 50-50 shot, and he won in a landslide. We went and we did a rally. Hardly mentioned today, and yet if he lost, it would have been the biggest story in the country, even bigger than this witch hunt stuff that you guys keep writing about. So here's the bottom line. There was no collusion. There was no obstruction. We've been doing this since I've been president, and actually, the crime was committed on the other side. We'll see how that all turns out. I hope it turns out well, but to my way of thinking, and I know a lot of you agree with me, the crime was committed on the other side. This whole thing was a takedown attempt at the President of the United States. And honestly, you ought to be ashamed of yourselves for the way you report it so dishonestly. Not all of you, but many of you. The way you report it. So I've said from the beginning, right from the beginning, that you probably can't go down two tracks. You can go down the investigation track, and you can go down the investment track, or the track of let's get things done for the American people. I love the American people. Drug prices are coming down, first time in 51 years because of my administration, but we can get them down way lower working with the Democrats. We can solve the problem on the border in 15 minutes if the Democrats would give us a few votes. So I just wanted to let you know that I walked into the room and I told Senator Schumer, Speaker Pelosi, I want to do infrastructure. I want to do it more than you want to do it. I'd be really good at that. That's what I do. But you know what? You can't do it under these circumstances. So get these phony investigations over with. The Wall Street Journal just wrote today, just a little while ago I saw it. Mr. Mueller wasn't obstructed in any way. This is the Wall Street Journal editorial today. Mr. Mueller wasn't obstructed in any way. His copious report, copious, 434 pages. Now they want to interview all of the same people again. They want to interview Jerry Nadler, who's been an enemy of mine for many years. He fought me in New York unsuccessfully, by the way. I've had great success against Jerry. But he was representing Manhattan, and he would fight me all the time on the West Side Railroad yards, many times, very unsuccessfully. He failed. I come to Washington, I become president, and I said, oh no, I have Jerry Nadler again? So, Wall Street Journal, Mr. Mueller wasn't obstructed in any way. His copious report was released for all to see, and there was no collusion. This is the Wall Street Journal. And there was no collusion between Russia and the Trump campaign. That's it. But they want to make this a big deal, whether or not.
Anyhow, we've only got a couple minutes left, so we're going to break away from that. But that gives you a little bit more idea as to what had transpired yesterday. Again, Pelosi has a meeting with Democrats, accuses the president of a cover-up, and then tells that to reporters on her way to the White House for a meeting. And then Trump comes into the meeting after hearing that, and then after 3 minutes goes out and he's done, and he tells it like it is at the Rose Garden. And that's exactly what we had just played for you. Pelosi went on and said something else afterwards, but we just don't have time for that. And I want to wish everybody a blessed Memorial Day. And in the moments that we have left, since it doesn't look like we're going to get to our music today, just want to remind everybody that this is the day where we honor those who had paid with their lives for military service for our freedom. You know, on Memorial Day, I think back to Private First Class Holly Mageau and Sergeant Michael Yashinsky. These are the two people that I had known and worked with in Iraq, and they were both sent home in body bags. They were friends of mine. And I'm going to be thinking about them on Monday. You know, we have the Memorial Day observances. I hope that you take the time to go to yours. And always remember that there are people going back to the Revolution up to present day who fought for your right to be free, so you can have taxation with representation. For Dallas Pearson, producer, I'm your host, Jeff Williams. You're watching North Star Oasis. Reminding you we have 215 shopping days left until Christmas. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.